Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The wedding had been modest, nothing extravagant, just a handful of friends, a few relatives, and a quiet exchange of vows in a warm, sunlit church on the edge of Enugu. Thomas stood tall in his simple navy suit, his palms slightly sweaty but steady as he slipped the ring onto Vera's finger. She looked radiant in a gown that wasn't designer, but suited her perfectly, lace sleeves, soft makeup, and a smile that didn't try too hard to be wide. There was something grounded about her, something that made her beauty linger even after she walked past. That quiet strength had drawn Thomas in from the beginning. While other women chased attention with loud laughter and dramatic flair, Vera moved like still water, observant, composed, impossible to shake. As they stood hand in hand before the altar, Thomas couldn't help but feel he was making the safest, clearest choice of his life. He didn't need anyone's approval. But even then, just behind him, he could feel the cold stares of his older sisters, Ngozi and Chinya, burning holes through Vera's back. He didn't understand it, not fully. They'd never said much, but their silence held something unwelcoming. Back in his family compound, the reception felt warmer than it truly was. His mother wore a practiced smile, serving food and shaking hands, but her eyes betrayed a watchfulness that wasn't festive. She barely spoke to Vera, and when she did, it was through questions disguised as greetings. "So you're the one who got our Thomas to settle down?" she had asked with a half-smirk. Thomas, too caught up in the joy of the day, missed most of the side comments and whispered judgments. He had always been the quiet son, the observer, and perhaps that was why his marriage surprised everyone. His older brothers were still unmarried, still chasing money, yet here he was, breaking tradition. Maybe it bruised a few egos. Maybe his choice of a calm, non-flashy woman like Vera had unsettled the dynamic. But Thomas didn't see the danger in it then. He was too focused on the soft way Vera held his hand through the crowd, too lost in the way she smiled at children and served his plate before her own. She didn't speak much during the celebration, but when she did, her voice was calm and respectful. Thomas saw her composure as grace. He believed it would protect them from all storms. Their first few months of marriage passed like a gentle breeze. The apartment they rented on the edge of town was small, but filled with peace. Mornings started with quiet prayers and the sound of boiling water. Vera would hum softly as she prepared breakfast, moving around the kitchen in her wrappers, while Thomas scrolled through job alerts on his phone or checked in on his travel documents. They shared long, unhurried conversations on the balcony at night, sometimes about the future, sometimes about nothing at all. Vera became pregnant 2 months after their wedding, and the joy was almost overwhelming. She began to write down baby names in a small notebook, and spent hours folding and refolding tiny clothes she had bought from the market. Thomas would come home to see her asleep on the couch, her hand resting on her belly, and he'd feel a strange, protective pride rise in his chest. Life felt simple, sacred, and full of promise. They weren't rich, but they were content. And when the news of Thomas's visa approval finally came through, after months of uncertainty, it didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like a gift. Neither of them could see the storm waiting just beyond that door. Thomas's departure was quiet, without much ceremony. The morning he left, Vera held his hand tightly at the airport, her eyes steady despite the ache swelling in her chest. She wore a long, patterned gown and flat sandals, and though she didn't cry, Thomas noticed her lips trembled each time she blinked. He hugged her longer than usual, whispered reassurances about how short the distance would feel, and promised he'd call every day. His flight was scheduled for mid-morning, and as he disappeared through the security gate, Vera stood there long after he was gone, one hand on her growing belly, the other wiping her cheeks dry. By the time she returned home, the silence of the apartment felt heavier. She moved from room to room absent-mindedly, touching the items he'd left behind, his shaving stick on the bathroom sink, his old slippers tucked near the door. Each object reminded her of him, but none of them could speak back. She busied herself with routines, cooking, resting, calling him in the evenings. For a few weeks, their long-distance marriage breathed with some ease. They shared laughter over bad Wi-Fi and discussed names for the baby. Vera kept herself afloat with those moments, clutching tightly to every smile and every sentence like it was a lifeline. But not everyone was comfortable with how Vera chose to cope alone. A few weeks after Thomas had left, his sisters came to the house, bearing exaggerated smiles and unsolicited advice. Ngozi, the elder of the two, spoke first, calm but assertive. "It's not good for a pregnant woman to live alone," she said, glancing around the apartment with an assessing eye. "Chinyu added quickly, 'We'll come and stay. Help you with things.' Vera thanked them politely, offered soft drinks, but firmly declined. She didn't want them in her space, not because she hated them, but because their presence always seemed to carry judgment. She later informed Thomas, assuring him she could manage just fine. At first, Thomas didn't press it. He knew his sisters were forceful and could sometimes turn kindness into surveillance. But days later, his mother called him and planted seeds of worry. "You can't just trust a woman completely," she warned in a low voice, laced with a tone Thomas recognized too well, concern pretending to be love. "Let one of your sisters stay, just to make sure nothing funny happens." Torn between loyalty to his wife and the invisible grip of family expectations, Thomas hesitated. Then, without telling Vera ahead of time, he made a choice. He called and told her Ngozi would be moving in by the weekend. Vera was quiet at first. Then, with a voice heavy with disappointment, she replied, "If that's what you've decided, then I have no choice." The first few weeks with Ngozi in the house were uncomfortable but civil. Vera tried to stay polite. She cooked, cleaned, and kept her distance, pretending not to notice the way Ngozi watched her every movement. At first, Ngozi didn't say much. She moved around like a second madam, giving instructions, sighing loudly whenever Vera rested during the day, and complaining over small things like how the floor was mopped or the soup was seasoned. Then came the subtle accusations, "You sleep a lot. You don't go to market often. You should be more active." Vera, trying to avoid confrontation, held her tongue. But the tension began to weigh on her. She would lie in bed at night, her stomach tightening with unease, whispering into the phone as Thomas asked about her day. The worst part wasn't just that he listened to Ngozi's reports, it was that he started to believe them. He began calling Vera more often, not to hear her voice, but to question her. "Why are you always tired?" "Ngozi said you don't even sweep." Vera tried to explain, tried to make him see that the peace they once had was unraveling, but with every call, she felt him slipping further away. The man who once praised her softness now sounded like a stranger poking holes in her silence. Vera's days became riddled with restraint. She moved around her own home like a guest, measuring every word and action. Ngozi had grown bolder with time, making thinly veiled comments that landed like bruises. She would mutter things like, "No wonder some men marry second wives abroad," or, "If this is how she behaves when he's away, imagine what she'll be like if he never returns." Though Vera kept a quiet face, inside her heart throbbed with bottled rage. The house no longer felt safe. It was a stage where she performed patience and endured suspicion. When Thomas called, his voice was no longer curious but critical. "Ngozi said you hardly eat. Is that depression or just moodiness?" he'd ask casually. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, dry and different, as though he wasn't speaking to the woman carrying his child, but to someone he could no longer trust. Vera's attempts to explain were always met with silence or redirected questions. He'd become cold in a way she hadn't prepared for, and his trust, which once felt firm and warm, had been replaced by distance shaped by someone else's opinion. Then came the night Vera felt something shift inside her, an ache that bloomed suddenly across her lower abdomen like fire. She had just finished sweeping the sitting room when the pain came, sharp and overwhelming. She called out to Ngozi, her voice cracking with panic, but the response was delayed and indifferent. Ngozi eventually walked out from her room, phone in hand, brows lifted. "You sure it's not those fake cramps?" she said, only half joking. Vera managed to whisper, "Please, hospital," before she slumped onto the floor. By the time she was rushed to the clinic, it was too late. The nurse who examined her gave the news gently, but the words pierced like glass. There was no heartbeat. Vera lay there, her arms lifeless at her sides, eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles above. The world felt suspended. The only thing that broke the silence in the room was the distant hum of a ceiling fan and her own shallow breathing. That night, in the loneliness of a clinic bed, she lost not just her baby, but a piece of her trust in the man who hadn't protected her when it mattered most. When Thomas finally called, Vera's voice was hollow. She told him what had happened in as few words as possible. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed, as if frustrated by news he had been dreading. "I just don't understand what you're doing with yourself," he said. There was no pause for grief, no words of comfort. He didn't ask what the doctor said or how she was feeling. Instead, he asked why she hadn't been more careful. He accused her of laziness, of recklessness. He even suggested that perhaps she had faked the symptoms to get attention. Vera held the phone to her ear, eyes wide with disbelief. In that moment, something inside her hardened. She realized she had been alone for longer than she thought. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas stopped calling. He no longer sent money to her account. Instead, he directed funds to his mother and instructed Vera to go and collect from Mama if you truly need anything. Shame burned through her every time she had to call his mother for money. The older woman never spared the opportunity to remind her, "If not for us, who knows what would have become of you?" Vera stopped calling. She stretched every naira she had left and learned to live with silence, a silence heavier than any scolding. The house had grown quieter, not the kind of quiet that brought peace, but the kind that settled in like dust, clinging to every corner. Vera moved like a shadow, her body still tender from the loss, her spirit bruised in places even she didn't know existed before. Morning routines became mechanical: wake, sweep, bathe, sit, stare. Sometimes she would hold her belly unconsciously, forgetting for a moment that it was empty now. The silence in the house mocked her. Ngozi no longer bothered with insults. She barely spoke at all, retreating into her room most days as if even her own script in the performance had grown dull. Vera didn't mind the withdrawal. She preferred the emptiness. It allowed her to grieve without performing strength. She spent long afternoons sitting by the window, watching schoolchildren chase each other through the dust, or traders shout across the street. Life outside moved on, indifferent to her stillness. Even the neighbors had started to whisper. They had noticed Thomas hadn't returned. They had noticed her weight loss. But no one came to ask questions. They simply observed, lips pressed together, pity carefully folded behind polite nods. Vera wrote letters she never sent. Pages and pages of handwritten pain filled an old-school notebook, letters to her unborn child, to Thomas, even to God. In them, she asked questions that had no answers and confessed truths she never dared to say aloud. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she wrote one day, "and the more I try to stay visible, the more they push me into shadows." She kept the notebook under her pillow, afraid someone might read it and call her bitter. Each passing day blurred into the next, and her phone barely rang anymore. Thomas had gone silent. The only calls that came were from his mother, short, sharp, and transactional. "Come and collect the money," she would say, then hang up before Vera could reply. It was a form of control, and Vera felt it every time she knocked on that iron gate and waited for someone to let her in like a beggar. She stopped going unless absolutely necessary. Hunger became familiar. Pride became her blanket. There were nights she lay awake, watching the ceiling and counting the seconds between the generator sounds outside. On those nights, she would whisper his name, not because she expected a reply, but because it reminded her that once she mattered to someone. By the fourth month of Thomas's silence, Vera stopped writing. The pages of her notebook were damp with old tears and dotted with smudged ink. She had run out of words. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back, thinner, harder, eyes dulled by waiting. Yet something inside her had shifted. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a decision. She would stop begging for what should have been freely given. She would no longer chase phone calls or knock on doors where she was only tolerated. And so, when Thomas finally called again, his voice distant and uncertain, she answered not with softness, but with silence. Not the kind that begged for attention, but the kind that told a story all by itself. A story of a woman who had learned to exist without applause, without validation, without the illusion of partnership. A story still unfolding, one slow breath at a time. The sound of his voice after so long didn't stir what Vera thought it might. It came one evening, not through an apology, but a casual hello, as if months of silence hadn't stretched between them like a cracked bridge. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed loosely against her ear, her eyes fixed on the dim wall clock above the dresser. Thomas spoke slowly, uncertainly, asking how she was, how the house looked, how things were going. Not once did he mention the baby they lost. Not once did he acknowledge the ache he left behind like an unfinished sentence. Vera answered quietly, measured, as if her voice had forgotten how to rise. She didn't ask why he'd stayed away. She didn't ask if he still blamed her. The truth was, her expectations had lowered themselves so far that even this, his voice on the line, felt like more than she deserved. Yet underneath her quiet responses, something fluttered inside her, something she didn't want to name. Not hope. Not yet. Maybe it was just a soft surprise of being remembered. When Thomas returned to Nigeria, it was without fanfare. His plane landed on a dull afternoon, and nobody was there to welcome him. Not his brothers, not his mother, not even Ngozi. The same people who once called him endlessly for money had become curiously unavailable. His mother sent a single message the night before his return. Hope you arrive safely. God bless. Vera was at home when he came in, carrying 2 faded suitcases and a plastic bag of toiletries. He looked thinner than she remembered, his eyes heavier. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She stood by the kitchen doorway, her wrapper tied carelessly at the waist, hands smelling of onions. He dropped the bag, looked around, and finally said, "You've kept the place clean." Vera gave a small nod, then returned to her pot of boiling yam without comment. That first night under the same roof again was filled with awkward silences, like strangers trapped in a space that once held love. He noticed the framed baby scan was no longer on the wall. He didn't ask why. She didn't offer a reason. They shared a meal, sitting on opposite sides of the table, their spoons clinking gently but never meeting each other's gaze. Bathreber's gaze. In the weeks that followed, Thomas wrestled with a discomfort he had never known before. Things were no longer handed to him with affection. His family, now aware that the dollars had stopped flowing, barely checked in. The same mother who once offered guidance now only sent prayer chain messages. His sisters had moved on, married, busy, distant. The house, which had once echoed with his authority, now felt like Vera's. She paid the rent. She stocked the pantry. She returned from work each evening with tired eyes and quiet grace, slipping out of her shoes and into the role of provider without complaint. Thomas, too proud to say the words, watched with a mix of guilt and awe. He scrolled job ads half-heartedly, but deep down, he resented the thought of working in Nigeria. "I'm still trying to find a way out again," he said one evening, not lifting his eyes from his phone. Vera nodded and replied softly, "But while you're here, life is still moving." Her words hung in the room like incense, not harsh, not condemning, but full of meaning. He said nothing in return, but for the first time since he came back, he felt the walls pressing in, asking questions he didn't yet have the courage to answer. Thomas spent most mornings staring out through the small living room window, his elbow resting on the rusted sill, a lukewarm cup of tea in hand. The streets outside moved with a rhythm that irritated him, hawkers shouting, tricycles honking, children in dusty uniforms laughing their way to school. Every sound reminded him that time was passing, and he had yet to reclaim the life he once imagined for himself. He didn't speak much during the day. Vera would wake early, sweep the compound, iron her clothes, and leave for work without fanfare. Sometimes she left food on the table, sometimes she didn't. Thomas noticed the difference, but never complained. He avoided job offers from neighbors and old classmates. To him, anything short of an international opportunity felt like failure. "I didn't travel to come back and start hustling for peanuts," he muttered once when a friend mentioned a logistics company nearby that needed drivers. He kept holding on to the idea of a second visa, of escape, of redemption somewhere far from home. He filled his days with endless applications, emails, and silent resentment. Vera, on the other hand, had settled into quiet endurance. She worked long hours as a secretary at a private school, returning home with tired feet and hands that sometimes trembled when she cooked dinner. The weight of survival fell on her shoulders, and though she never shouted or made demands, the strain began to show. One night, while they were both seated in the living room under the hum of a faulty ceiling fan, Vera looked at him and asked gently, "Don't you think it's time to do something here, just to keep us going?" Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was weary, honest. Thomas didn't answer right away. He tightened his jaw, stared at the blank TV screen for a while, then said, "I didn't go abroad just to return and struggle like everyone else." His voice was calm but firm. Vera didn't press further. She only nodded and stood up slowly, picking up the plates from the table. As she walked toward the kitchen, a quiet sadness wrapped itself around her. She had known struggle before, but this kind, the kind that came from a partner unwilling to move, was heavier than she expected. Days became predictable. Thomas would sit indoors, scrolling on his phone, or pacing the compound when boredom pushed him outside. Sometimes he'd join the men at the junction, exchanging half-hearted greetings and discussing politics or football. But he always returned home with the same weight in his eyes, pride fighting against desperation. Vera continued to bear the responsibilities in silence, her patience thinning in places even she couldn't conceal anymore. The apartment grew smaller, their conversations fewer. At night, she lay on the bed facing the wall, while he lay behind her, both of them awake but pretending otherwise. Their bodies didn't touch. Their breaths didn't sink. They shared a roof, a past, and a fragile hope, but everything else sat in limbo. Each passing day was a quiet reminder that love without action becomes something unrecognizable, something that lingers like smoke after the fire is gone. It happened just before dawn, the kind of hour when the world holds its breath and spirits whisper their secrets. Thomas stirred in his sleep, drenched in sweat despite the cool air. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional distant bark of a neighborhood dog. In the dream, he was back in his father's compound, standing under the mango tree that had long been cut down. The leaves rustled though there was no wind, and from the shadows, his late father emerged, barefoot, his white native attire spotless, eyes heavy with quiet warning. He didn't shout. He didn't frown. He only looked at Thomas the way he used to when something was terribly wrong, but needed to be said gently. "Your wife's spirit is provoked," he said in a low voice that carried through the thick air. "She cried too long in silence, and the heavens do not ignore such tears. You must ask her forgiveness, not with words alone. Humble yourself. The path you seek will remain closed until her heart opens again." Thomas tried to speak, but no sound came out. He reached for his father, but the old man stepped backward into the dark until there was nothing left but the sound of rustling leaves. He woke with a jolt, heart pounding, shirt soaked through. For a long time, He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, trying to catch his breath. The dream had felt too real, too precise to be dismissed. It wasn't just the image of his father. It was the way the air had changed around him, the strange stillness that lingered even now, as if part of the dream had followed him into waking. He glanced at Vera, still asleep on her side of the bed, her breathing slow, her back to him. The guilt that had buried itself deep inside him stirred uneasily. He remembered the way she had looked at him weeks ago when she asked if he would consider working, not with anger, but with a tiredness that made him feel smaller than he liked to admit. He had brushed her off, buried himself in pride, and waited for the universe to bend to his timeline. But now, with the echo of his father's voice still fresh in his ears, he felt a shift. Something in him cracked, not in a dramatic way, but like a slow yielding. He stood up, paced the room once, then dropped to his knees beside the bed and pressed his forehead against the cold tile. "Please," he whispered, not to Vera, not yet, but to the night, to the silence, to the father who visited him from the other side. That morning, Thomas did something he hadn't done in a long while. He waited for Vera to wake up. When she finally stirred, she turned to find him seated at the edge of the bed, his face drawn, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep. For a second, she blinked in confusion, not sure what to make of his stillness. He didn't speak right away. He reached for her hand, and to her surprise, he lowered himself to his knees. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling, the words thick and unfamiliar on his tongue. "I've wronged you, deeply. And I know it. Not just for the baby, not just for the silence, but for making you carry everything while I stood still." Vera sat up, unsure whether to believe what she was seeing. He looked up at her with the same eyes that once lit up the day they got married, but now they held something else: fear, regret, longing. "I had a dream," he added quietly. "My father said nothing will move for me until I ask for your forgiveness." He reached into his bag for a gift, only to remember he had none. Shame filled his face. But before he could speak again, Vera reached out and touched his head gently. "Get up," she whispered. "It's not the gift that matters. It's what you do after this." Then she closed her eyes and prayed, not loudly, not with bitterness, but with a calm strength that shook the very air in the room. In the days that followed Thomas's apology, the house felt different, not completely healed, but lighter. He began to wake earlier, often before Vera, and moved around the kitchen in clumsy attempts to boil water or prepare simple breakfast. It wasn't about perfection, it was about effort. The silence that had once wrapped itself around their lives now gave way to careful conversations, short, sometimes awkward, but honest. Vera watched him from across the table, not with suspicion, but quiet observation. She didn't rush forgiveness. Instead, she allowed space for his actions to speak. And they did, in small but consistent ways. He fixed the faulty hinge on the kitchen door, swept the front steps without being asked, and started taking interest in things that mattered to her. At night, when she came back tired, he'd ask about her day and genuinely listen. There were still moments of hesitation, times when she caught herself guarding her heart. But beneath that caution, something old and tender began to stir again, like the cautious reopening of a window after a long storm. One Saturday afternoon, while she was doing laundry, Vera returned to the room to find Thomas seated at the edge of the bed, a printout in his hand. It was a confirmation email for a job interview at a small logistics company on the mainland. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him quietly. "It's not what I dreamed of," he said, almost apologetically, "but maybe it's a start." Vera nodded slowly, then reached for his hand. "A start is all we need," she replied. He went for the interview 2 days later, wearing an old but ironed shirt and shoes Vera had polished for him the night before. When he returned, he looked different, more grounded. "They said they'll call," he said. And they did. He was offered a position as an assistant operations clerk. The salary was modest, but it was something. His first paycheck was used to refill the gas cylinder, replace a broken bathroom mirror, and buy 2 bags of rice. It was the first time in a long while that Vera didn't carry the weight alone. At night, they began to sit outside on the balcony again, talking under the soft hum of distant generator sounds. It wasn't like before, but it was becoming something new. Several weeks passed, and the quiet rhythm of their restored partnership began to feel natural. One evening, while Thomas was helping Vera fold laundry, she looked at him with a strange softness in her eyes. "Do you still want to travel?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He paused, then nodded. "Yes, but this time I want us to go together." She smiled faintly, then stood up and opened the drawer beside the bed. From beneath a pile of wrappers, she pulled out a small brown envelope. Inside it were crisp notes, naira and dollars, carefully saved over months. "I've been keeping this," she said, "in case you ever decided to try again." His eyes widened. He hadn't expected this kind of faith. She told him she had also applied for a soft loan to complete what was needed. "We'll do it right this time," she added. And they did. The second application was more organized, more truthful. This time, the approval came faster than either of them anticipated. As Thomas packed his bags, preparing for another journey, he held Vera's hands and said quietly, "They will never come near you again. I promise." She didn't reply. She only nodded, and in that moment, it wasn't just words that mattered, but the unshakable vow behind them. Thomas stepped onto foreign soil with different eyes this time, no longer wide with naive ambition, but sharpened by failure, loss, and quiet redemption. The new country was colder, the pace faster, but he had come prepared. He arrived with a clear focus, clutching tightly to the second chance Vera had helped him build. He rented in a quiet part of town, had no television or furniture in the first few weeks. He laid his mattress on the floor, folded his clothes into plastic drawers, and spent his nights thinking of how not to waste what he had been given. There were days he worked 12-hour shifts as a warehouse assistant, unloading boxes in silence, his body aching but his heart strangely at peace. He saved ruthlessly, avoided unnecessary conversations, and called Vera every night without fail. She'd sit by the window with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to his exhausted voice describe every little detail, what he ate, what the foreman said, how the cold was biting his fingers. The distance between them still existed, but it no longer felt like separation. It felt like two people climbing the same hill from different sides. Back home, Vera continued working, paying bills, and preparing for what was coming. She had become familiar with waiting, but this time it wasn't haunted by doubt. She kept a journal again, not filled with sorrow, but with plans, baby names, recipe ideas, reminders to renew her passport. Slowly, her cheeks began to round out again. Her laughter returned in small, unexpected bursts. Neighbors started noticing the shift. "You look brighter these days," one auntie from the compound remarked as Vera hung clothes on the line. She didn't offer explanations, just a smile and a quiet nod. She had learned to hold her joy close, not out of fear, but protection. The family that once tormented her had long gone silent. When they realized there was no more money to squeeze out of Thomas, their calls faded. The silence from them was more of a relief than an absence. Vera focused on her own path, no longer bending herself to be accepted by people who once watched her with narrowed eyes. The peace she cultivated was not loud or dramatic. It was found in early morning walks, long baths, and cooking for herself with care. 7 months after Thomas left, the visa process for Vera was completed. She had packed weeks before the approval even arrived, her suitcase tucked neatly in the corner of the room, like a symbol of belief. The day she boarded the flight, she wore a simple Ankara blouse, flats, and carried only 2 bags, one for her clothes, one for the documents and letters she had kept over the years. Thomas met her at the airport with a small bouquet of flowers and eyes that looked like home. They didn't hug tightly or cry in the open. Instead, they walked side by side into the cool air, hand in hand. Life in the new city was not instantly perfect, There were bills, language barriers, cultural shocks, but they faced it all as a team. A few months later, Vera found out she was pregnant again. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the wind play with the trees, Thomas turned to her and said, "This time, we'll protect everything." And she believed him, not because he said it, but because he had already started doing it. They settled into their new life abroad without ceremony, learning to adjust to unfamiliar rhythms one step at a time. The apartment they rented was modest. 2 rooms, white walls, and a small kitchen with narrow countertops, but it felt like enough. Vera filled the space with quiet routines, unpacking their clothes with care, pinning small Bible verses above light switches, and planting a tiny potted hibiscus near the window that caught the morning sun. Thomas, on the other hand, embraced the rhythm of work with a kind of devotion he hadn't known before. Every morning, he dressed in layered shirts and thick socks to fight the foreign cold, riding 2 buses to reach the facility where he worked as a warehouse attendant. He didn't complain. Not when his fingers cracked from the chill or when his back ached from lifting boxes. Every ache reminded him of the path that had brought him here, of the night he knelt before Vera, empty-handed but full of regret. In the evenings, he returned home to the smell of pepper soup or jollof warming on the stove, the sound of Vera's soft humming grounding him after long hours of silence. They rarely went out, not because they couldn't, but because being home together felt like the greatest gift. As the months passed, the city around them slowly became familiar. They discovered the nearby market where Nigerian spices were sold at ridiculous prices, and they laughed at how far they had come to buy things they once took for granted. Vera got a part-time job at a local daycare, spending her afternoons singing to toddlers and helping with snacks. The work was simple, but it brought her joy, and it allowed her to feel useful again, no longer confined by the shadows of the past. She walked home most evenings, hand on her growing belly, feeling the movement of new life beneath her skin like a quiet promise. At night, they talked about names, never rushing to choose one, simply savoring the dream of calling someone ours again. Their lives were still tight, still measured by budgeting apps and second-hand furniture, but they had learned to see abundance in places where others only saw survival. Thomas often found himself watching Vera when she wasn't looking, folding clothes, sipping tea, resting her hand over her stomach as she read, and each time he did, he felt a lump rise in his throat. Not of sorrow this time, but awe. That after everything she was still here, still his. One evening they sat on a wooden bench in a quiet park, the sky above them streaked with soft orange and purple clouds. The wind brushed lightly against Vera's face, and she closed her eyes, resting her head on Thomas's shoulder. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched a child chase bubbles across the grass, the laughter drifting like music. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "I'm not the same man who left you behind." Vera turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. "I know," she replied, her voice warm but steady. "And I'm not the same woman who waited." There was no need for more words. Not a return to what was, but the birth of something new. Their love had been tested, fractured, and nearly lost, but it had found its way back, reshaped by truth and forgiveness. As the evening deepened and the lights of the city began to flicker on, they remained on that bench, hands clasped, hearts steady, grateful for the long road behind them, and the quieter, kinder road ahead. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.